Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 201, Author Meets Critics, Joseph and Lucy Smith's Tunbridge Farm, an Archaeology and Landscape Study. My name is Christopher Smith, and I'll be serving as the panel moderator. And our panelists today are Mark Staker, Kyle Walker, Michael Riggs, and Paul DeBarthe. Mark Staker is our author today. He wrote this book with Dawn Enders on Joseph and Lucy Smith's Tunbridge Farm. And he received a PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida. And he has worked for 27 years in the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The John Whitmer Historical Association has honored him with the Best Book Award and the Best Article Award for his superb work in Mormon history, which I've used myself many times. And he considers his associations in JWHA among the highlights of his life because he's a sweet guy. Kyle Walker received his PhD in marriage and family therapy from Brigham Young University. He is the author of 2 books on the Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith family, and more recently, a biography of William B. Smith. He is a faculty member at BYU Idaho in Rexburg. Michael S. Riggs is the former JWHA former president who presided over its 30th annual meeting. His MAR was done at Park University, and he has presented and published a number of peer-reviewed articles in Mormon studies. He's a professional public historian who has worked on archaeological investigations on Mormon and Native American projects. He has presented papers at the Missouri State Capitol, a Unitarian Universalist convocation, and at George Washington's Mount Vernon estate. Paul DeBarthe mentored in archaeology beginning at the Homestead Summer Kitchen and Bee House in 1971. He worked as assistant on-site archaeologist through the mansion excavations in 1977 to 1983, and at the William Law site in 1984. Since then, he has worked with Locke McKay and Robert Smith to excavate the Joseph Smith Sr. double log house in Nauvoo, followed by the Samuel Smith and Hiram Smith office sites. idignauvoo.com is the webpage for those projects. They expect to dig again in May to June next summer, and they offer that experience to volunteers. Our presenters will each have about 12 minutes. At the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A. If you have questions for our presenters, please put them in the Q&A section rather than in the chat section. That's down at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little icon that says Q&A. If you put your questions in the chat, they may get lost because the chat is often fairly active during these sessions. But if you put them in the Q&A, then we'll have them queued up to go at the end of the session. So you can do that at any time during the session, and then we'll have all your questions ready to go. And with that said, we've got about 12 minutes per panelist, so we don't have a lot of time here. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Kyle Walker, to our first critic.
Thank you. Good morning. I believe I'm the only member of this panel who has not participated much in archaeological research, so I'll leave that evaluation to these other experts on the panel today. My training is in family dynamics, and so most of my review will focus on that perspective, particularly the last chapter of the book. I should mention that I've had opportunity to be with both Donald Enders and Mark Staker on location at some of these historic sites, mainly in Palmyra, New York, but also in Kirtland, Ohio. And I've enjoyed listening to their unique historical perspectives. In fact, several of those tours were with Mark as part of the John Whitmer conferences. While those experiences were memorable for me personally, they also expanded my appreciation for the different lenses and perspectives of evaluating history and the important insights that can be gleaned from utilizing such approaches. They both love examining details most historians would miss. Several decades ago, there was a call for Mormon historians to study more of what was termed everyday history, including utilizing material culture, musicology, folklore, photography, sociology, diet, and patterns of recreation. Since that time, there have been many studies from those fields that have expanded our understanding of our shared historical past. Staker, with his background in anthropology, and Enders, with his training as an archaeologist, have continued to enlarge our perspective of some of the earliest events of Mormonism, even pre-Mormonism, in this latest volume. The book is short, about 70 pages in length, but as one reviewer of the volume pointed out, the authors seem to have hit a sweet spot for length, as a 300-page treatise on these archaeological details might end up being a bit tedious for the average reader. The volume focuses on the Smith family farm in Tunbridge, Vermont, where Joseph Smith Sr. and his wife Lucy first lived after their marriage, on land originally purchased by Joseph's father, Asel. There are chapters that describe these plots, amounts paid, the terrain of the farm, the homes and outbuildings, and how the farm was utilized to earn a living. And finally, a chapter on the religious culture where the Smiths resided, and the influence that had on Joseph and Lucy's differing religious views. One insight I found interesting was why the Smiths originally selected that particular farm. The authors make a case that the family was likely drawn to the farm because it was fen land, which was wet most of the year and grew tall cordgrass. They note that cordgrass is prized by farmers even today for feeding livestock, especially cattle, because it is richer in carbohydrates than wheat or barley. Staker and Enders document a history on the Smith line of owning fen land, and the Asel Smith family were dairy farmers and had a considerable stock of cows. While the men led out in the coopering business, the Smith women led out in dairying, which likely generated a steady, consistent income for the family. Their conservative estimate was 3 shillings a week, but they note they could have easily brought in double that amount. They presume these cows would have been small, productive Jersey cows, which would have been the only type that could possibly live on that terrain, as heavier cattle would have sunk in the soft, wet ground. I'm currently working on a biography of Catherine Smith Salisbury, a daughter of Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith, and one of the interesting things I found about Catherine is that she always had a milk cow. She and her sisters had the responsibility in their youth to milk the family cows on the Palmyra farm, and along with their mother, tend to the barnyard chores. After Catherine married, and even when her family is completely broke, she always had a milk cow. She personally milked a cow up until her death at age 87, and rarely, if ever, missed a day. So now, based on Staker and Enders' research, I know it was part of her heritage and a role that women had assumed on the Smith line for generations. Staker and Enders also make a note of the variety of apple trees still growing on the farmland, possible descendants of the Smith trees. While the authors mention purchasing applesauce at a later time, providing evidence that it was part of the family's regular diet, I saw no reference to the later apple orchard the Smiths established on their Palmyra, New York farm, which might have provided further evidence that the Smiths likely had an apple orchard on their Vermont property. One area I found intriguing was the author's insight that both Lucy and Joseph Sr.'s ancestors were not farmers by profession. That was true of the next generation as well. In my research on the Smith family, I discovered patterns of work among Joseph Smith Sr. and his boys that continued a preference for alternative forms of work than farming. I picked this up in my research on William Smith, who appears to have had a disdain for farming. Joseph Sr. sought more entrepreneurial efforts as opposed to farming, including opening his store at Randolph, Vermont, his work as a cooper, his attempt to market ginseng, as highlighted in the book. One insight these authors document is that sentiment had been evident for generations, documenting that, quote, the probate records of the Smith men document plenty of woodworking tools, but few farming implements, unquote. And that even these agricultural tools that were left behind were more characteristic of raising cattle than farming, evidence of their work at dairying. The most relevant chapter for my research was the final chapter entitled Lucy's Meadow, Her Grove, and Her First Vision. Here, the authors recount the differing religious backgrounds of Asel and Joseph Sr. from Lucy Smith and her Mack ancestors. I found it interesting that Asel was instrumental in bringing universalism to that area of Vermont. When Asel was elected town selectman, he helped negotiate a solution that allowed Universalists to acquire pews in the church then under construction. The Smith form of Christianity was influential enough that noted Universalist preacher Dana Ballou began long circuit rides from his home in Massachusetts to preach in this remote area of Vermont. His success in Vermont, certainly hastened by the Smith family, led Ballou to eventually relocate to the area near the Smiths, where he published an influential book on Universalism in nearby Randolph. Staker and Enders document how Ballou was greatly influenced by authors such as Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine. I'll come back to Paine in a minute. The authors do a good job of highlighting the influence Ballou had on Asel Smith, as evidenced in Asel's final writings to his family, where he encouraged them to not only consult the scriptures, but sound reason, and promoted teachings of universal salvation. They contrast this with Lucy Smith's ideology, which embraced visions and dreams as sources of inspiration, and emphasized Christ, not just God the Father, as a divine being. Lucy was drawn to Methodism at the time, whose meetings were often camp meetings held in the woods outside of villages. In contrast to Ballou's universalism, Methodists emphasized gifts of the Spirit, getting answers to prayers, and receiving spiritual manifestations. Staker and Enders do a good job of providing documentation of some of those camp meetings that were convened in the region where the Smiths resided, and the religious enthusiasm that led hundreds of converts early in the Second Great Awakening. These authors summarize Lucy's mountain Christianity was naturally distant from her husband's rationalism. This led to a clash between Lucy and Joseph and her Smith in-laws. Due to Lucy's pleading, Joseph attended a few Methodist meetings to oblige his wife. However, once Joseph's father Asel and his older brother Jesse discovered he had attended Methodist meetings, they came to his house and angrily threw Thomas Paine's Age of Reason at him, telling him in no uncertain terms to read Paine's book until he believed it. This confrontation led Joseph to request Lucy to stop attending Methodist meetings, which obviously she found hurtful. In the midst of this turmoil, Lucy sought seclusion in a grove of trees, which the authors argue was likely in a cherry orchard on their Tunbridge farm. The farm, these authors continue, also became the setting for her inspired dream, which Lucy said came later that night in answer to her prayer. The dream reassured her that her husband would eventually come around to her view of religion, where they would ultimately be more unified in their religious practice. The dream was in a setting that included a clear stream of water, a grove of cherry trees, all in a magnificent meadow, a perfect description of their Tunbridge farm. While the story is not new, I wrote about Joseph and Lucy's religious conflict in my dissertation more than 20 years ago. What Staker and Enders provide is fresh details about the context of that conflict. They have identified preachers who interacted with the family by name, recounting their influence in the area, and how those preachers likely affected the religious ideals of both Joseph and Lucy. As far as I've read, this is the first time many of these specific individuals have been named. Also documenting the camp meetings held in the area and Methodist marked success in making hundreds of new converts in this rural area was new to me. One could see the influence these camp meetings had on Lucy much earlier than we first thought, which was the origin of the family's later attendance at camp meetings in Palmyra, New York, during a later revival period. The authors recount how these Methodist preachers were renowned for encouraging listeners to retire to the woods in order to find answers through prayer, and how local groves were in time filled with praying people everywhere. Lucy would utilize that practice in seeking consolation throughout her life. I can document at least 4 times when she retired to a secluded grove of trees during times of struggle in her history. So it's meaningful that these authors have documented the beginning of that practice and the context for when Lucy first engaged in finding a secluded grove where she could pray. The documentation throughout the book is worth reviewing. There are in fact 36 pages of notes, about 1/3 of the length of the book. In my opinion, these notes are worth the price of the book. The flow of the book is a bit uneven, as one chapter does not necessarily flow neatly into the next. The last chapter, for example, seems only loosely connected to the others. But on the whole, the book adds substantially to our knowledge of the history of the Smith family, Joseph and Lucy Smith's earliest years, their work patterns, property transactions, the marked influence of Joseph Sr.'s failed ginseng adventure, and finally, the religious division that existed within the marriage, which was ultimately only reconciled through their son Joseph, his dreams and visions. Thank you.
Thanks. Next up, we have Michael Riggs.
Great. It's exciting to see published for this first volume in the new John Whitmer books Archaeology series. It further demonstrates how JWHA is an organization is dedicated to promoting understanding historiography, outstanding historiography. I'm reminded of the great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's concept of using a toolbox to further our research endeavors. Often the answers we seek in our projects require us to open ourselves to multidiscipline resources. I have enjoyed a lifelong love of history, so imagine me, an eventual practical pacifist, playing with army men as a child. My first encounter with archaeology, ironically, was as a first-time visitor to Nauvoo, where Paul DeBarthe invited a friend and myself to spend a little time digging with a trowel at a site they were excavating in 1979 on the Joseph Smith properties. Paul and I later shared a decade working together at 3 distinct sites in Caldwell County, Missouri. Mark and Don's work at the Tunbridge farm in Vermont resonates with Paul and I, as we are engaged in producing our own contribution, documenting the 1837 Charles C. Rich log house in far west Missouri. The Tunbridge volume nicely demonstrates the importance historical geography contributes to better understanding context. This book does a very good job of explaining the significance of the site's terrain, vegetation, and locality within New England. I will leave the discussion of the archaeology, like calls it, to Paul, who is the archaeologist. And given our limited time, I'm going to focus the attention also on the Smith family and American Universalism. First, I want to applaud Mark and Don for including the Universalist connection in their book. As they demonstrate, especially for Joseph Smith's side of the family, it was an important part of the Smiths' proto-Mormon experience, which began in Massachusetts and flowered while in Vermont's hill country. I would add that trying to drill down on just what influence Universalism had on the Smiths has been a question of interest to me for a long time. The conundrum is trying to identify which Universalism the Smiths adhered to in this period. Mark and Don speculate that the Smiths have had been aligned to the Hosea Ballou form of the religion. And I'm going to pop up. Okay, I won't. Of the religion. They argue that it accounts for Asel's rationalistic traits, since Ballou was acquainted with both Vermonter deist Thomas Paine, who's the author of Age of Reason, and Ethan Allen of the Green Mountain Boys fame. The author also favored Ballou over the Massachusetts-based John Murray, presumably because Ballou had moved, like the Smiths, to Vermont and was an itinerant preacher in the same region. Actually, Asel converted to Universalism in Topsfield, Massachusetts, which is less than 25 miles from where John Murray pastored the Universalist Society near Boston. The Smiths were 79 miles away from Dana, Massachusetts, where Hosea Ballou was serving in his first pulpit. I do believe it's logical to assume that the Smith family did know Ballou while living in Tunbridge area, given their respected localities. I'd like to offer a second Universalist influencer, however, that may well have provided more applicable impact on Joseph Smith Sr.'s proto-Mormon experience and later his son, Joseph Smith Jr. I'll begin with a quote from an unpublished address by Unitarian Universalist scholar Peter Hughes, which provides some context. Universalism was one of a set of new exotic faiths that sprouted during the era of the Revolutionary War. The historian Stephen Maroney, in his Radical Sects of Revolutionary New England, classifies Universalists with 2 other exotic faiths, the Free Will Baptists and the Shakers. The soon-to-be Mormon Smith family went through a Universalist period of the strange activities of the Smiths. Among the strange activities of the Smiths was treasure hunting. They used special stones and magical devices to help them look for valuable minerals and caches of buried coins. This same theme pops up several times in Universalist history. Abner Nealon was one of the several Universalist ministers and laymen to engage in such a project. He actually, Abner Nealon, when he was ordained Universalist minister, the sermon was preached by Ballou. But anyway, so these people all knew each other. Other Universalists, it was true, were scandalized by such behavior, the money digging. In their search for respectability, they hoped to cover the trail leading to their less presentable siblings' faiths. One of the founders of Universalism was a visionary, Caleb Rich. Universalists searched the scriptures, but did not always find what they were searching for until they had some direct religious experience. What the earliest Universalists discovered was the love of God, the idea that God's love could neither be restricted or thwarted. It was a simple faith, not loaded down with complicated doctrine. It was not so much transmitted by theological discourse, but as by plain and uneducated conversation among family and friends. It was a religion made for those who would rise in the world. There was room waiting for them at the top, in the world as well as in heaven. A few years ago, says Peter, I was led to make an interesting discovery about the geography of early Universalism. John Murray's branch of Universalism, established in the eastern coast of Massachusetts, was actually the smaller part. The larger part that he's been describing started in southern Worcestershire County, Massachusetts, around Milford and Oxford. He continues, the Universalist forebears were struggling farmers, tradespeople, and mechanics. They were rational and down to earth in a down to earth way, but esoteric and enthusiastic for the new and wonderful. They challenged the old ways, made home remedies, sought old treasures, and talked with the spirits of the dead. They remembered they remember how close to in kinship the Universalism had to Mormon Joseph Smith, Mother Ann Lee, and the spiritualist Fox sisters, is to broaden the liberal sympathy and to increase Unitarian Universalist self-knowledge. BYU professor Trevon Hatch says Caleb Rich was an important forerunner in terms of his example as a New England visionary who saw the Orthodox churches of his day as false. Hatch explains why. Caleb Rich of Warwick, Massachusetts, was raised a Baptist, but converted to Universalism after seeing a vision in 1772. One day, Rich heard a still small voice that said to him, your motive is from selfish principles, for fear of failure and endless misery. You always had been and now are excited to pray from the same false motives. At that moment, he saw a celestial being who told him he was a stone which was placed unerring wisdom into God's building before the foundation of the world. Rich followed this celestial being to Mount Zion, where he was commanded to avoid the Baptists. When they reached the summit, Rich saw the house of the when the lights come on God and the gate of heaven. Instantly, the vision closed. Rich never returned to the Baptist church, but joined the Universalists. He soon became influential in that church and was eventually ordained a New England Universalist leader. One evening in April of 1778, Rich saw another vision just after retiring to bed. He saw a person, or likeness of one, enter his room carrying a Bible. The person quoted verses from the New Testament, then stated, there is not one formal church among them that stood in the apostolic rectitude or contended for the faith once delivered to the saints. He was instructed to proclaim the same gospel that Christ preached. In his book, The Democratization of American Christianity, Nathan O. Hatch says that Caleb Rich was the most important leader of Universalism in rural New England during the last quarter of the 18th century. Rich said, I could say in truth that the gospel that was preached by me was not after man, or for neither received it of men, nor was I taught it by men, but by revelation of Jesus Christ through the medium of the Holy Spirit and the opening of my understanding to understand the scripture. Peter Hughes's earlier reference to one-time Universalist minister Abner Nealon having been involved in Money Digger, comes up again in connection with Joseph Smith. In a 2003 article posted on pathos.com, gives a compelling evidence that Joseph Smith Jr. was influenced by the post-Unitarian minister, Universalist minister, and accused atheist Abner Nealon, and became the archetype figure of Korihor in the 30th chapter of Alma. Nealon was the distinction of being the last. He had the distinction of being the last American who was tried and convicted of blasphemy. At the time, Abner was being charged. A splash was being made in the press about it. Joseph was just then beginning to write Alma in the Book of Mormon. Abner always protested that he was not an atheist, but a pantheist. He died, ironically, just months after Joseph Smith Jr. in Iowa in 1844. Yes, it is true that Hosea Ballou was in close proximity to Tunbridge, but New Haven, Vermont, where Caleb Rich lived, was only 50 miles away. Caleb had been a mentor to Hosea in the decade when Ballou was in the process of converting to Universalism. While living in Massachusetts, and both migrated to Vermont in 1803. Ballou and Rich were likewise itinerary style preachers. While Hosea was more rational, as Mark and Don point out, Caleb was more esoteric. Hosea Ballou was a very distinguished writer and orator, while Caleb Rich was not, feeling more comfortable in smaller group gatherings. There was not a rivalry between them. The rivalry between them was not the same as they had experienced with John Murray, who didn't like either one of them very much. The Smiths likely knew them both, but Caleb, the more expressive visionary, was perhaps a bigger influence. That Asel threw Thomas Paine's Age of Reason on the floor of Joseph Smith Sr.'s home could tell us that the elder Smith feared his son was more aligned with the metaphysical rather than the Enlightenment Universalist camp. Question. One last tidbit. Caleb married his wife, Electa Doolittle, in Warwick a year before an event known as the spiritual wifeism controversy broke out, and involved her parents leaving each other for the spouses of two others after being persuaded by a Baptist preacher named Moses Hicks that men and women had their spiritual husbands and wives as well as their temporal, and consequently, where the Spirit led them to love and admire each other in a spiritual sense, there was no criminality in the connection. Doolittles were not by any means the only family involved in the scrape during the spring and summer of 1778. Based on later events, Joseph Smith Sr.'s family seemed to reflect the more esoteric Universalist traits represented by Caleb Rich and other rural Universalists than the more sedate Hosea Ballou, who later left the Hill Country to assume the main Universalist pulpit in Boston. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was fascinating. And now we go to Paul DeBarthe.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to participate. It's been a long time for the archaeologists to have a chance to join in with the historians. I, first of all, want to be able to thank the John Whitmer books for publishing the first of an anticipated series of archaeology and history monographs on the legacy of Mormonism in America and potentially beyond. And I'd like to anticipate as well that the prospect of a volume with chapters devoted to various sites significant to Mormon history has great appeal. Second, I want to express appreciation to Mark Staker and Don Enders for starting this series with a site celebrating the patriarch and matriarch of the movement. While you have investigated their first home in Smith Settlement in Vermont, it has been my privilege to uncover their final home together, the double log house built for them in Nauvoo, Illinois. I hope to add that monograph to the series eminently. Third, since it behooves commentators to recognize both the genius of such an effort and the weaknesses it exposes, Let me congratulate the authors on an excellent historical context for the project. An example of this, the kind of research they have done highlights, for example, the Joseph and Lucy Smith and the Joseph and Hannah Smith, both residents of Tunbridge. So easy to confuse two different families living in the same vicinity. Another example, their discovery that Asa Smith, Joseph Sr.'s father, had grown up in a home on a slope above a fen and brook in Topsfield, Massachusetts, then replicated that arrangement of a house on a slope overlooking a fen and a brook for his new residence in Vermont. And this then uncovers an intriguing pattern, and for Joseph Sr. to take advantage of that same pattern when he moved to Manchester adds to the mystery of history. So to what extent do landscape and architecture influence personality? The authors delineate Joseph's realm versus Lucy's, with Joseph responsible for the outbuildings, tilled fields, woodlot, and fences, where Lucy maintained areas close to the hearth and the home. Lucy's meadow provides an interesting corollary to her vision, demonstrating the significant connection between landscape and religion, as highlighted by Kyle Walker. And one wonders how far such a corollary extends into the history of the movement. Prophets and their audiences clearly were and are limited by vocabulary and environment they know. Relating familiar landscape to the ethereal message of a dream would appear to serve as an effective communication device, and one used repeatedly by authors of scripture. The hops cultivation presented in the account merits attention. Not only did the authors make a good case for the likelihood of the Smiths producing their own hops, having a spring, barrels, manure for the hops, and ready market, they cite Lucy selling her homemade beer in Palmyra. My understanding is that the pollen samples that they have tested have verified the case for beer production at Tunbridge, and I would like to know more about those samples and what levels were they taken, what parts of the site, and so forth. I would like then to screen share briefly here, and whoop, I'm disabled on that. The screen share, if that will allow me, would allow me to pull in the summer kitchen at Nauvoo for comparison, so you'd have a chance to see the later structure that they occupied.
Paul, do you want to try again?
Yes, please. It still says host disabled. There, I think we're getting it. Now then, do we get to see?
Looks good.
All right, if we have the summer kitchen, the picture of the summer kitchen adjacent to the Smith homestead in Nauvoo, where the senior Smith lives in 1839, provides for us a comparison. I appreciated the description of the initial log hut with nail-free elm bark roofing, housing 10 people and 140 square feet. The old couple would have had much more privacy and space in the summer kitchen by the homestead when they moved to Nauvoo in 1839. But you can begin to imagine 140 square feet to put 10 people in there, that's really a crowd. Their final home in the double log house across Main Street to the east was 1 rod by 1 rod, that's 16.5 feet. And that would have been a square with a half rod dog run, and then another comparable structure to the south for the servants, made it so that in their 44 years together, the senior Smiths attained comparative housing comfort. Now, then, criticisms of the archaeological process and evidence recognize brief time and limited resources available, yet they call attention to details as yet unanswered. More as a curiosity than a criticism, I would raise the point that why use 5-foot squares in a grid when the site would have been laid out in rods and chains, and a 5-meter marker would have corresponded closely with a rod used in the common measurement of the time. The 60 by 25-foot grid could have been a 66-foot chain by a rod and a half covering the same area. The metric system is standard for archaeology, so why did they go to 5-foot squares? But now to the critical considerations. In the initial investigation, Staker and Enders trenched to identify a foundation. The next year, they returned to grid and excavate the home foundation and cellar. While we have a photo of Don Enders using a trowel in the kitchen, it appears after one in which he uses a shovel in a square in which standard levels clearly are not being employed. To what extent is this archaeology? Why are they not using levels to help in the distinguishing of the age of the deposits? After 15 days of excavation, they excavated an industrial building by a trench 20 feet long, 2 feet deep along a foundation. A second trench across the building was 20 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 18 inches deep, with 10 feet of trench inside the foundation and 10 feet outside. A third trench was 5 feet long along the southern wall, 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. All this trenching, without consideration of levels, makes the archaeologists shake their heads. The paucity of diagnostic artifacts found makes it difficult to tie the archaeology to the history. And am I lost here? I think I may have lost my audience. Let me go ahead, presuming I haven't lost my audience.
We're still here.
Okay. The paucity of artifacts makes it difficult to tie the archaeology to the history. The bowl portion of what the authors call a 1790 Mac family spoon is clearly one of the most diagnostic artifacts. Unfortunately, it is identified in a footnote as one found after the excavation by a visitor to the site. Again, the archaeologist shakes his head. We do have a photo of a screen being used on page 3. How did it miss something the size of a spoon? Let me move to the fork. The report on the handmade bricks used in the hearth helps to authenticate the site, as does the two-tine fork. However, the fork is asserted to have been in the backfill, pushed into the cellar. When found in the backfill, how can you justify calling it the Smith family fork and associate it with the 1760s? It looks very like the four found in the 1971 Homestead Summer Kitchen excavation by Robert Bray. While those forks might date to 1750, they might. Robert Bray identified the ones found in the summer kitchen as post 1800. And then to Wedgwood. Over 100 small fragments of creamware are noted, with about 50 in a photo on page 40. These, without a maker's mark, are attributed to Josiah Wedgwood. While Josiah Wedgwood pioneered creamware and supplied it to royalty, by 1780 he was exporting 80% of his output to Europe, not to America. Thomas Wheeldon and the Leeds Pottery were shipping creamware to America. Jeffrey Godden points out that 20 or more Wedgwood competitors replicated his formula for their imports to America, and at Nauvoo, half a century later, we find the Wedgwood mark frequently. It was a popular name. The ceramics were not from Josiah, whose mark is always impressed, but from John W. Wood, who legally adopted the middle name Wedge and used a transfer printed mark. Unless you have the impressed Wedgwood mark, much better to call it a creamware and not attempt to attribute the higher class Wedgwood name. And to edgeware. The illustrated edgeware, dated by the authors from 1780 to 1810, lacks the scallops and undulations characteristic of that period. It better fits the unscalloped, simple, repetitive patterns in the 1840s to the 1860s. Although it came from disturbed backfill, the authors attribute the earlier date to it, suggesting a presupposition rather than the story the artifact encapsulates. Backfill rarely fits the period of original occupation. It generally includes later materials unless scooped up from an Aboriginal or earlier historic site. In contrast, the double log house site in Nauvoo produced 143 examples of edgeware, none with precisely the same pattern, but you can see why the question would be raised about Tunbridge samples being attributed to an earlier date. And to the hand-painted. Hand-painted ceramics may well fit the period claimed for them. The three associated with the hearth are identified as burned, one is banded. While the banded ware might belong to the earlier settlement period, the authors acknowledge it might also be 19th century. An alternative explanation for why it was found in the hearth would have been nice. Let me highlight the contrast here. Tunbridge produced 3 hand-painted pieces. A photo from the patriarch's house in Nauvoo shows over 100 hand-painted specimens. And then let me go one more. In 156-2, square 72, level 3, produced just these in that one level of that one square. And with 15 decorated sherds from one level and one square, then what accounts for the difference in numbers of artifacts found on the 2 sites? Tunbridge was occupied from 1791 to 1804, more than a decade. The double log house in Nauvoo from 1840 to maybe 1845, half a decade. Yet it produced 2,563 artifacts in the first 3 squares tested. And then finally, let me get to the brown transfer. The 2 of the Tunbridge decorated ceramics are brown hand-painted pearlware attributed to local production. With the good historical work done on the documents, why not on the local potteries? Brown transfer printed wares from the patriarch's last home included several designs, including the Minerva pattern produced by Podmore, Walker and Company from 1834 to 59. With 6 decorated sherds in the text and only 4 evident in the photos, the significant category begs additional attention. Then I want to go on, I'll leave that picture, but I go on to the other types. And by the way, I didn't see any glass, and there should be some bottle glass showing on a site like this. The identification of an oxidized, hand-forged 18th century rosehead nail, also found in the backfill. We have to accept on the author's word that it has not been treated with electrolysis to make the identity clear. The same is true of the hand-worked cut nails illustrated with the claim that one was L-shaped of the type used in flooring. Any nails associated with the 1790 structure would have been hand-forged, since the patent in America by Jacob Perkins for the cut nail process was granted in 1795. Yet they have 2 pages of notes on possible local nail production, some as early as 1785, showing excellent historical research. But the detailed history does not displace the need for detailed artifactual analysis. When a site merits archaeological investigation, let the artifacts be found in situ. Let them be photographed, cleaned, marked with provenance, and studied for the story they contribute to the site. Trenching with a shovel and backhoe has its place, but where legacy is important, archaeology with scientific controls is preferable to religious ones. The process is slow but productive. The rush to identify foundations and rebuild for proselytizing or other purposes bypasses too much information that might well add chapters to the legacy of the movement. If the authors had dug into the site with the same thoroughness they dug into the history, we would have a much more valuable monograph. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And now we will go to Mark Staker for his response. Did we? Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, I put my screen up before I unmuted, and it made that a little difficult. Let's see, am I unmuted?
Yes.
I went back and forth a few times, so good. I hope you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes.
I've just thrown up, I have 6 brief slides just to allow me to kind of talk about a few things, not knowing what people would bring up. I wanted to leave plenty of time to kind of address general issues. I wrote this and I did the research, but my colleague, Don Enders, was the spiritual advisor, if you will, and the mentor went with me and we worked on this together. We started out in, this is late September of 2016 on Miners Hill in Palmyra, where we did some other things. Don's not holding a seer stone. That's a large mushroom that was growing on the hill. But I just wanted to note that this project included contributions from many, many different people. We got a research grant from the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was only a modest amount, about $2,000. And those of you who've done archaeology before know that it's a very expensive proposition. That's only a tenth of what you would normally need to do something like this. And so we had lots of volunteers and lots of, the bricks were studied by Hartgen and Associates in New York, who did that free as a favor to us. And the bones were studied by University in Denver, Colorado, that did that for free. Jerry Kill, a local dairyman who actually ran the dairy on the Smith property in Norwich, Vermont, took us around, and many, many others. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and that we were building on lots of early information as well. This is Larry Dahl. He and Ivan Barrett went out in 1972 and identified the location that we ended up digging at later on. You don't see anything there. It was not easy to use this photograph to help with anything other than to know that they had been there and said that there was a site there. So we did two brief projects. Paul mentioned this photograph of Dawn doing some trial work, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. We worked under difficult conditions. It snowed the first time we were out there. The second time, you can see Don trying to keep the mosquitoes off him. They were horrendous and ate us during the project. And so we had challenges to address as well. And we were introducing some new concepts to our readers, because things like landscape studies, most people aren't familiar with that kind of work. How do you study a landscape? What does that mean? And so trying to write this up required explaining a little bit of how you do that, in addition to just explaining the results of the process. And some of the explanation that we spent a lot of time on, things like trying to defend or suggest that the family had grown hops. Later on, once we did the pollen study, it didn't really matter anymore. We could have done in a couple of sentences said, yes, indeed, they grew hops on their property. And I'll come back to that too in a bit. Let me first, I'll just go through each of these, and Kyle is right about it being a bit disjointed, and this response is going to be a bit disjointed because I'll deal with each presenter separately. But that last chapter was thrown on kind of as an afterthought, partly trying to make this compelling to a larger audience. In 2020, the bicentennial of Joseph Smith's first vision, to say, well, he wasn't the only one. You know, his mother mentions, she says his first vision when talking about her husband's first dream, her own experience with a first vision. It was a visionary family, trying to make those connections. So there was some perhaps disjointedness in that. We faced the challenge. Most of you may know that archaeology reports are only written up after a lot of effort. How do I word that? They are notoriously late or non-existent. It's hard for archaeologists to write the reports, and they are also notoriously never read. They're not readable materials. And so if you want to have people read it, you bring some challenges to the project, that you want to make this readable and you want to make it compelling so that people can get something out of that. And we faced those challenges in trying to do this. Hopefully we accomplished something that made it readable. I think that it is readable and of interest to most people, but there could have been ways that we did that better. Kyle pointed out the apples, that the Smith family grew apples in New York, and we didn't really make that connection. They were growing apples all the way along. There was a large apple orchard on the Mack family property in Sharon, Vermont, where Joseph Smith Jr. was born. And they continue, one of their close neighbors, Peter Ingersoll, that lived next to them, had a 60-acre apple orchard the family was involved in. Those things we didn't include in this book. Maybe we could have included a little bit more of that. And there's clearly a lot more research that needs to be done on this property. We wanted to keep this as a focus, just looking at the foundation, partly because we didn't have the budget to do something bigger, and we were hoping that others might come along afterwards to do more. Even the pollen study brings a lot of new questions that need to be pursued by the family. So those were very helpful comments, Kyle. Thank you. And I also jotted down some notes that I'll get in touch with you later on. There are lots of things I'd like to continue to talk about on that. Mike, I appreciated your comments on universalism. I think that at least the literature that I've read through downplays the family's universalist experience and suggests that it was only in Vermont and then only briefly. They had a long and extensive connection with universalism from its very beginnings. The Mr. Webster that John Smith mentions went with the family up to Vermont. Turns out to be Joshua Webster, who was in the Gloucester congregation of John Murray. And John Murray's two congregations in Howard Hill, where the Doody family lived, and his congregation in Gloucester, Topsfield is right between those on the road, and so he's going through Topsfield all the time. And there's a lot to suggest that Joseph Smith Sr. had strong and detailed universalist connections for 30 or 40 years by the time he gets to New York. But I appreciated your pointing out that Caleb Rich is really an intriguing individual that ought to be looked at more closely. I had looked at others who'd written about him, and I dismissed him as an outlier because he isn't quite John Murray, and he's not Hosea Ballou. But I think that maybe he's playing a much more integral role in the Smith family's universalist thinking than I had acknowledged beforehand. And so in the book, I emphasize the rational universalists and try to play that up. And I've done in other research as well that I've been writing up. I've been emphasizing the rational universalists, and I need to go back and rethink that. So I really appreciate that that thought. And I think part of the reason I do that is because the only details we really have are Lucy mentions, that confrontation with Tom Paine's book and throwing the book into the house, and that's part of the rational universalists. They have a cousin, one of the Gates family members, that goes up to Vermont and is introduced by a family member to universalism. He doesn't say who the family member is, but the Smiths are their family up there. And he comes back reading Tom Paine, and he's turned off by universalism because of Tom Paine and that skeptic approach. And he ends up following Lorenzo Dahl, the ultra emotional Methodist. And so I really appreciated those thoughts as well. Thank you for that. Paul, you've given me a lot to think about, and I need to wrestle with that in much more detail. The hops, as you pointed out, we were able to do more on that. This book ended up being a great proposal for getting additional funding. When Chris launched the book on Facebook, those of you who were there, that noticed that there was kind of a movement to, well, let's fund that additional hops research. And I ended up going back and getting a grant to do that, so that I didn't have to deal with lots of different individuals who were also generous in offering money to do that. And so I had a single grant, went back, we did 6 samples, 4 were in the floor of the home, and 2 were outside to be base samples. And we found some really interesting things out about the property by doing that. One was that there was a lot of Canadian hemlock growing there when the family arrived. I assumed maple because that's what's out there today. And I learned that the little ice age and the temperatures at the time created a very different climate, and global warming, as it's been happening over a couple of centuries, has been changing the landscape there in some significant ways, and I suspect it will continue to do so. So we learned that detail. We found cattail pollen in the samples, so that told us that not only was this a fen that they were trying to farm down in the valley area, but when they arrived, it didn't just have cordgrass, but lots of cattails growing in that area, which was a detail that I had not imagined when writing the material up. But of course, the most interesting detail, there were others as well, I'll pass over for now, but the most interesting was that we found hop pollen in the floor of that industrial building. And I had imagined, oh, well, there's a hop, because they'll gather the hops in there. It's an oast. They're drying those hops to make beer. We'll find lots of hops, hop pollen there because it's where they're collecting it. But it makes perfect sense that if they're growing the hops on the hillside, they'll have plenty of pollen out there, probably even more so. And that's what we've actually ended up finding in those base samples that we took outside of the foundation, have a lot more hop pollen than inside. And so what that told us was they were not only processing hops in that oast in the building, but they were growing hops on the property. So when Lucy Mack Smith talks about they're cultivating the land, and our landscape study suggested, oh, well, they're not plowing every year this land, you still have those undulations in the soil. Maybe they were growing hops. Well, yes, they were growing hops. Were they growing apples as well? It makes good sense. And so Kyle's point, I think, is well taken, that there probably a lot of apple growing there as well. They're probably doing cider apples. Why don't we know that for sure? Well, there's also apple pollen in this building, but not much of it. And there are apples growing around in the area to where we just can't say anything definitive about apple growing. But we know that there are early apples still growing on the property. They've been there as long as the current family owns the property. And so I think that was a really helpful detail to be able to follow up on. Partly that was what one whole chapter of the book was trying to lay the foundation for. This is likely what was going on. And now we could say in a few sentences, this is what they were doing. So it helped us get to that point. There were a lot of details in the book that were tentative because this was a preliminary study. This was 2 guys out doing their own independent project on private land. The Beavers family were very generous in letting us work on their property. We returned all the artifacts to them. They were theirs and they wanted to keep them. So it gave us a very limited window in which to do our study. But we felt that if we did this study, it would help actually in the long-term preservation of the site, because they are excited about the site. They want to see it preserved. We buried it back up, to do that well, and then we are hoping that eventually somebody else can come back and do more and do it more extensive.
Mark, I have to stop you because we are at time and we've got to end the session more or less right now. But if you have a final comment you want to make, you can go ahead and do that.
No, thank you for doing that. I should have been looking at the clock. So I appreciate these comments. And if you have questions, if we're out of time now, I'd be more than happy to answer those via email or in some other way.
You do have a question from Mark Ashurst McGee, who wants to know the 3 most important implications of your book. So I will let you email him about that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for presenting. And with that, we'll conclude the session.